A vicious militant is systematically targeting innocent civilians.
The guy was so brutal. If you kill everybody else, eventually people stand back and say, whoa, we got a big guy.
An elite group of special forces are hand-picked from across the world to take the terrorists out.
You do a series of raids that is devastating.
They are led by a maverick general with radical new methods.
If you hit an organization repeatedly enough, you could actually cause them to collapse.
It's a race against time. They must stop him before more blood is shed.
Nothing's routine if there's lives at risk.
Iraq, April 2006. In the dead of night, a helicopter lifts off from a desert airbase. On board is a group of elite soldiers from a secretive unit, codenamed Task Force Black.
On the way to a mission, I'm often asked, were you nervous? You know, I don't have time to be nervous because there's so many things happening. I mean, everyone is busy.
They are bound for a house in an area known as the Triangle of Death. Their mission is to arrest a senior member of the deadly terror group, Al-Qaeda, in Iraq.
You should always be expecting the worst. What if we get fire upon? What if the fast rope is in the wrong spot? What if we get around and the helicopter is downed outside the compound?
Their targets are ready to resist with extreme violence.
Almost as soon as they were through the door, they were hit by a hail of bullets. The people inside clearly knew somebody was coming. They were armed and they were waiting.
The team quickly kill the first militant and move in to clear the rest of the building.
There were half a dozen assault rifles. There were dozens of hand grenades. There were at least 2, possibly 3, wearing suicide vests.
And at the top of the staircase, one of the suicide bombers steps out of the shadows and detonates his vest. By now, the militants are fighting with everything they have. 2 more appear on the roof and spray the assault force with bullets. The soldiers of Task Force Black are accustomed to this kind of brutal violence. They face it on a daily basis.
At the end of the day, we're going to win, and we'll do whatever it takes to win.
Though the Special Forces don't realize it, this house holds the key to finding the most wanted man in the Middle East. One of their captives tonight will lead them to Abu Musab al Zarqawi, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He has murdered thousands of innocent civilians and spread terror throughout the region. His campaign of violence is so effective, the US has created a Black Ops task force with just one mission: taking al-Zarqawi down.
This was a guy who had murdered thousands of people. In fact, he murdered many more people than Osama bin Laden ever did.
To understand how al-Zarqawi rose to become one of the most feared terrorists on the planet, we must look to the town of Zarqa, Jordan, 500 miles to the west of Baghdad. Al-Zarqawi was born here in 1966.
Zarqawi's background is he was a criminal. You know, he spent time in a Jordanian prison for sexual assault. He was a drug dealer. He was a petty criminal in Jordan.
Accounts differ as to whether he was actually a sort of hard, boozing villain in his hometown. But it's certainly true that he was involved in some forms of crime and that he probably had some kind of epiphany, some kind of moment when he realized that his life was going the wrong way and that Islam was the answer for him.
In 1989, al Zarqawi travels to Afghanistan to become a freedom fighter against the Soviet occupation. It is here that he meets his mentor and inspiration, Osama bin Laden.
He had come up during the course of the war in Afghanistan. People understood his importance as an operational leader, and he was clearly trusted by bin Laden and the al-Qaeda senior leadership. He was well-liked by the soldiers in al-Qaeda. He was well-respected by the leadership. He was incredibly capable. He was experienced.
Over the next 15 years, partly with bin Laden's support, al Zarqawi grows to become an accomplished terrorist. By 2003, he is in Iraq, fighting against the American-led invasion. The early months of the war appear to be a swift and stunning victory as the old regime melts away. But al Zarqawi is waiting in the shadows to start a new campaign of violence.
When he was deployed into Iraq, we understood as the American counterterrorism community that this was a significant event. He had that unique combination of skills that would allow him to be a real force for al-Qaeda against us inside Iraq.
In the months that follow Saddam's overthrow, chaos envelops the country. Al Zarqawi takes full advantage of this, actively working to stir up the hatred between Iraq's two main religious groups, the majority Shia Muslims and the minority Sunnis. He creates a militant group with the aim of killing as many Shias as possible, thus sparking retaliations and creating a brutal cycle of violence. It is called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI.
We mistakenly look at these organizations as terrorist groups. This is too narrow. These are revolutionary organizations that want to spread an idea. They don't want to just spread weapons or explode suicide. The idea is they can return to what they call a caliphate, a 14 centuries old concept that there's a purer way to live according to the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad. So the idea is, where can you find a springboard to do this? Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then you get Iraq.
The militant Islamists were prepared to do pretty much anything. And of course, quite soon they discovered that bombing things like the UN offices in Baghdad, the International Committee of the Red Cross offices, and then moving on to targets like markets, queues outside police stations where the police were recruiting, all those sort of things, were actually far easier targets than American convoys or American bases, where the T-walls had gone up. The base represented a hard, concrete face to the world. And, you know, yes, if you drove a truck up, you might kill the guy on the gate who was checking passes, but you were unlikely to achieve a major result.
Al Zarqawi orchestrates numerous suicide bombings. A devastating series of attacks in March 2004 kills close to 200 people at Shia holy sites.
So they shifted their targeting towards the sort of softer targets that could yield more spectacular results. And of course, soon they were killing dozens, scores, maybe even sometimes over 100 people in a single complex attack.
On the 11th of May 2004, Al Zarqawi is linked to a new outrage. A video of an American hostage appears on a jihadist website. The American, deliberately dressed in a Guantanamo Bay-style orange jumpsuit, is Nick Berg, a 26-year-old communications engineer from Pennsylvania. Berg was kidnapped in Iraq a month previously, and the video shows his unimaginably horrific death.
The video is one of those horror show type of jihadist videos in which a long knife is used to cut his throat, and you can even hear the sound of knife on bone and the screams. It's a truly horrific video. But the point is, at the beginning of the video, in the original form it was released, it says, Abu Musab al Zarqawi slaughters an American.
The CIA determines that Al Zarqawi himself is the hooded man wielding the knife.
The guy was so brutal, so tough. It's sort of like a mafia family operating in New York City. If you kill everybody else, eventually people stand back and say, whoa, we got a big guy, a big dog on the corner in town, and we better be careful.
Zarqawi could see that if he publicized himself and what he was doing as a really militant, irreconcilable enemy of the Americans, that this would bring him money from the collections in mosques for the jihad. It would bring him volunteers from across the Arab world. And in that calculation, he was right.
He really put the crosshairs on his own head by all these spectacular acts and all the press that he was receiving.
So just the brutality and the effectiveness of his efforts against first the Americans and then the locals, I think people stood back and say, this guy's a blowtorch. We better let him roll.
What the Iraqi Sunnis started to believe, and those people who had joined al-Qaeda, was that if the Americans can't kill Abu Musab al Zarqawi, can't stop him, then maybe he was predestined to win the war.
Berg's death is a signal to the world that al-Zarqawi's reign of terror is escalating out of control. But secretly, the US is planning a series of black ops designed to bring him crashing down. In Washington, ending al-Zarqawi's reign of terror has become a top priority for President Bush and his inner circle of advisors.
You come in, and the days where the momentum, you feel like the momentum hasn't been with you, you start with, your thought is really so simple. It's let nothing blow up today. Let me get through today with nothing blowing up.
It wasn't that we were losing, it was just like, when will this end, and how will it end?
Al-Zarqawi seems to have the power to strike at will, and yet somehow he remains completely hidden.
We really didn't know what he was doing in Iraq, and we didn't know, like, did he have wives there? Did he have kids there? Where was he moving? What was his support network?
What most counterterrorism officials will tell you is you go through periods where you feel beleaguered, right? You go through periods where you're making very limited progress and you're trying to understand why that is. Why does he seem to have momentum behind him? And you're trying to figure out, what can I do to change that dynamic? But anybody who's been in this fight will tell you that's what happens. You go through these periods and you've got to push through it. You've got to understand what is it that's giving him the momentum, and how do you take that away from him?
No one even has a recent photo of al-Zarqawi, let alone any idea where he is. He doesn't use a mobile phone, for fear it will be tracked. He only meets with a select group of trusted advisors, whose own whereabouts are unknown.
He really was kind of a ghost for a long time. And you would get bits and pieces here, but usually by the time you got them, they were outdated.
In September 2003, a new general arrives in Iraq. His name is Stanley McChrystal. He has radical new ideas for hunting down al-Zarqawi and destroying AQI.
General McChrystal is one of the most dedicated individuals I've ever met. He is a driven warrior. He artfully looked at where he could make the most impact.
Stan McChrystal, unique guy. Years of experience with our Special Operations Forces at all levels, former Ranger commander. You get personalities that are that strong, that experienced, that well respected. The force falls in, and their operational experience starts to show. And it's just the type of guy you want in that position.
McChrystal is the newly appointed commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC.
And certainly in every conflict, the JSOC has been there. They were in Grenada, they were in Panama, Gulf I, Gulf II, Kosovo. Pretty much where there's a conflict, you can depend that JSOC has been there first, and they're always the last to leave.
Formed in the late 1980s to coordinate the work of America's elite troops, JSOC controls the best of the best from across the US military. These are the so-called Special Mission Units, Navy SEAL Team 6, Army Delta Force, and the Air Force 24th Special Tactics Squadron, active in every corner of the world, often on highly classified missions, the men of JSOC are experts in precise, targeted strikes against hard-to-reach enemies.
It was a very secret organization, and it was tasked with fighting the most sensitive types of mission against US enemies, obviously, in the context post 9/11, terrorist enemies, counter-terrorism.
At the start of the war, JSOC's mission had been to find and arrest the leaders of the old Iraqi regime, the men famously depicted on a deck of cards, with Saddam Hussein as the ace of spades.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Within a year, even Saddam himself is in custody. But this creates a power vacuum, and al Zarqawi is ready and waiting to step into the breach.
In decapitating what some called the Ba'athist or nationalist leadership, they probably assisted the growth of al-Qaeda in Iraq, because by taking away the leadership figures, the sheikhs, the former generals, the key people, the key Ba'athists, they left quite a lot of angry, young, militant Sunnis with nowhere to go.
McChrystal takes a strategic decision to abandon the hunt for ex-members of the old Saddam regime. Instead, he will focus almost all of his resources on just one man, Abu Musab al Zarqawi.
Our commander gave us a big speech. The point of the speech was the only way to win the Iraq War and to stop the violence between Sunni and Shia is to find and kill or capture Abu Musab al Zarqawi.
To get to al Zarqawi himself, McChrystal knows he needs to build a complete picture of his terror network, AQI. He sets up a large command center at an old Iraqi airbase in the town of Balad, north of Baghdad. Then he invites all of America's many competing spy agencies to set up camp there. From now on, interagency turf wars are banned, and everything will be shared.
When we started working with Special Forces, and I remember General McChrystal, who's a real hero in this war, I remember him coming into CIA headquarters and saying, you know, we need some of your people. And as any bureaucrat will, you sit back there and say, all right, is this dog going to hunt? What are we trying to do here?
The idea is that every piece of information, however insignificant, will be brought here and fed into a massive database. If McChrystal and his men learn everything they can about AQI, they may be able to quickly find its weakest points and strike.
Senior leadership understood that in order to win a counterinsurgency, you could not win it by being on the defensive. You had to go on the offensive.
You would be shocked at, one, the focus on the targets. These are the top 10. Here are the intel collection tasks. This is how we're moving against them. And as information breaks on each one, you see the various forces and the interagency and the allies, and in some cases the Iraqis, move against that. And it's an unfolding story every day. It's constantly updated. It never blinks. It never sleeps.
A key part of the plan is to pump each captured militant for as much intelligence as possible. So McChrystal sets up a special detention facility right next door to his command center.
The interrogation unit essentially composed of where we kept the prisoners and also our interrogation rooms, and then our analysis room and our desks, which we called the Gator Pit. Part of our facility was, you know, an old Saddam era aircraft hangar, and then the rest of it was just kind of like makeshift built additions to a warehouse, essentially.
Using his huge store of the most up-to-date intelligence, McChrystal unleashes the most dangerous weapon in JSOC's arsenal: the special mission units of elite frontline soldiers. These men will also work in an entirely new way. Historically, they ran only 1 or 2 major operations per year. Now they will conduct multiple raids on a daily basis.
I can remember visiting Iraq, And watching them, they didn't go out once on a night, they went out multiple times. Oftentimes the intelligence operators would go with the special forces.
It all starts by piling in the back of a striker vehicle and sitting in a very cramped space that's very hot and very dark. And then you're going through the streets, you know, and there's all types of hazards, roadside bombs and snipers. And by the time you get to the target, you're usually already like drenched in sweat, and your adrenaline's going.
You're fired up, you have your game face on, you need to be intense because intensity and momentum are critical as far as winning the day. Nervous, not really nervous.
You're jumping out of the vehicle, you're running down the street. When it gets really exciting is when you have more than one house. Oftentimes, these terrorists, they would run out of one house and jump a wall and into another house, and then you'd have to raid a second house, and then sometimes that would end up with a third or fourth house.
Don't move! The critical factor is speed. Every time a militant is captured, the members of AQI around him will try to cover their tracks by reorganizing the entire network.
You had information that would perish. It was time sensitive. That sometimes needed to be run down to the ground, and maybe that would be the only chance of preventing a catastrophe or an act that would kill, a U.S. soldier or our ally.
It's a cat and mouse game. The terrorists constantly change their routines, abandon safe houses, and recruit new men to replace those that have been lost. But if McChrystal's people can work faster than their enemy, they will destroy AQI before it can regenerate.
You take technical information, things like stuff you get off a captured cell phone or a captured hard drive. You take detainee operation, what detainees are saying about the network they just came from, and you put them in a big hopper and say, our software, our analysis, our people have to be good enough so they can put together a picture of what that network looks like. And not only put that picture together, do it well enough so that an operator can conduct a raid within 24 hours. You're doing it for years on end with people from every agency in town. Incredible.
In a way, the most important idea that General McChrystal and JSOC brought to this whole thing was that if you hit an organization fast enough, accurately enough, and repeatedly enough, you could actually cause them to collapse.
JSOC soon develops into a well-oiled machine. Every night, 4 Black Ops task forces spread out through Iraq, performing up to a dozen raids at one time.
Go! Go, go, go!
Each group is assigned to take down targets in a different part of US-occupied territory. To the north is Task Force Red, formed from the Army's 75th Rangers Brigade. To the west, Task Force Blue, made up of US Navy SEALs. The center of Iraq will be the responsibility of Task Force Green, staffed by the US Army's most elite unit, Delta Force. These soldiers are joined by a team of elite troops from Britain's Special Air Service, the SAS, operating under the codename Task Force Black. The SAS are the pioneers in the art of black ops, such as this daring hostage rescue from the Iranian embassy in the heart of London in 1980. In particular, they are masters of surveillance and intelligence gathering.
There was undoubtedly a feeling among many of the American intelligence operators that the SAS and the other British special forces had skills that were quite unusual and quite different to the type of skills that Delta Force or the SEALs had. The American training and operational activity had all been based around, if you like, action man, leaping out of helicopters, boarding ships, all this kind of stuff, assault roles. Whereas the British Special Forces, because of their long involvement, not just in Northern Ireland, but in places like the Balkans, where they'd been involved in the hunt for war criminals, they had skills to do with the patient nurturing of targets and groups of targets. Now, that involved surveillance, it involved creativity, stealth, about how, for example, could you get a remote surveillance camera onto a balcony overlooking a target you might be interested in. They came up with all sorts of things. They drove around in Baghdad taxis, they disguised themselves. And the American intelligence people saw some of this during the early years in Baghdad, and they liked it.
McChrystal and his team work through their targets, night after night. The supply lines of foreign fighters are intercepted. Bomb makers are taken out of action. Mountains of intelligence are captured and analyzed.
They would do a raid, they would get what's called pocket litter, or hard drives, you know, pieces of paper out of people's pockets. They'd come back, they'd bring it to analysts back on the base from the CIA who would go through that information. That would lead to another targeting package, and the Special Forces would go out again. That sort of continuous feed, continuous loop, is what made them incredibly effective.
Despite 2 years of taking al Zarqawi's network apart, the ultimate objective, the man himself, still eludes them. But the task force is about to find a crucial breakthrough, one that could finally stop al Zarqawi for good. Strike teams from JSOC, the US Joint Special Operations Command, are staging multiple raids across Iraq every night. This secretive organization joins together elite special forces from across the US military and its allies. They are under the command of a single leader, General Stanley McChrystal. By the start of 2006, their system of rapid-fire raids and sophisticated intelligence gathering is beginning to pull apart the terror network known as AQI. They are also getting ever closer to its feared leader, Abu Musab al Zarqawi.
I'm going to target each discrete, tiny little element, and if I can begin to pull little elements away, suddenly the whole thing falls of its own weight.
Whenever they get close to al Zarqawi, he seems once again to slip through their grasp. Yet, he still retains the ability to perpetrate devastating attacks, especially against so-called soft targets, like Shia mosques, killing hundreds at once. In April 2006, al Zarqawi releases a video which, for the first time in years, shows his face.
The fact that he was a charismatic military and tactical leader led to this larger-than-life sort of myth about him. I think it fed his ego as well. He kind of began believing his own press, if you will.
You had little kids in the street, you know, pretending to be Abu Musab al Zarqawi because he was essentially invincible.
The video urges al Zarqawi's supporters to show no mercy against their so-called enemies, Iraq's Shia community and the US forces. Just as that video hits the airwaves, one element of the JSOC task force is preparing the latest in their long series of nightly raids. It's a team from the British SAS, operating under the codename Task Force Black. They are now concentrating on an area to the south of the capital. It is a militant heartland, and the soldiers call it the Triangle of Death.
The British Special Operations Task Force conducted a series of operations in the Triangle of Death in early 2006. And they planned an operation in April 2006, which they called Larchwood 4.
Operation Larchwood 4 is a dangerous and daring raid to arrest a mid-ranking al Zarqawi henchman, codenamed Abu Haida. McChrystal's intelligence machine has pinpointed him to a safe house in the town of Yusufia.
We put surveillance on that safe house, and we watched it continuously for, I think, almost a month. And then one day, we see this meeting happening there. These cars converge. And so we quickly sent a raid team to go out and capture the members in that safe house.
The team know that houses like this are often well defended with heavily armed men, some wearing suicide vests. But the house could also contain a number of innocent civilians.
If they're a threat, then you engage. If they're not a threat, then you don't. You have to be able to make that decision in a snap. That's what special operations trains for. That's what they're really, really good at.
At just after 2 a.m., Task Force Black sets off in their helicopters for the target house. Following them is a support group from the British Parachute Regiment, the Paras. They will form a cordon around the house to prevent reinforcements arriving and arrest so-called squirters, targets trying to make a run for it. A short flight of just 20 minutes puts them within range of the house.
The SAS men realised it was not going to be a typical sort of mission. They thought they could hear sounds inside the building. They approached very gingerly, and to their surprise and satisfaction found that there was a door just wide open. Almost as soon as they were through the door, they were hit by a hail of bullets. These people were heavily armed, and they were prepared to fight to the death in order to prevent the SAS from getting in and taking their man.
The team quickly withdraws to a safe distance. They must decide whether or not to resume their attack.
Some of these incidents where heavy resistance was encountered, they simply pulled back and dropped a bomb on the building and killed everybody inside. For many different reasons, the SAS commander on the ground decided not to do that. They wanted this person alive for intelligence purposes. They felt it was worth trying to fight their way in, and that's what they did.
Raid compounds. The objective is to keep the opposition on the run and keep him on the defensive.
The team encounter their worst nightmare. A suicide bomber.
As one of the SAS men went up the stairs, he detonated. The SAS man was blown down the stairs. Fortunately for him, he wasn't seriously wounded. He had cuts and bruises, but of course the suicide bomber had blown himself up.
Meanwhile, outside the house, more militants join the fight. They rain fire down on the special forces.
Another man wearing a suicide vest, a squirter, fled out the back of the building and hid under a car.
The outer cordon of paratroopers enters the fight. Taking out the two militants firing from the roof, they turn their attention to the suicide bomber hiding under the car, shooting him dead before he can detonate his vest.
So at the end of a sort of terrifying 20 minutes, there were a whole lot of dead people.
Inside the house, we captured 5 senior-ranking members of al-Qaeda.
The operation is considered another successful day at the office for Task Force Black. The main target of the raid, Abu Haida, is in custody, along with 4 other detainees. In addition, a treasure trove of intelligence is recovered from the house.
They sweep everything up they think might be of relevance. Mobile phones, computers, everything else, and they take it away. As a result of Larchwood 4 and subsequent operations that it generated, a huge amount of actionable intelligence came into JSOC's hands.
When a JSOC analyst starts to probe one of the captured computers, he discovers something extraordinary. Raw footage of al Zarqawi himself, from his recent propaganda video.
Through traces of DNA that were found on it when it was sent back to the US for analysis, they would conclude it was his laptop.
The analysts realize that al Zarqawi must have left the house just hours before the SAS arrived.
We actually started to get excited that we were close because Zarqawi was in that house the day before we raided it. And that's when we finally had the confidence to think that we were hot on his trail.
They had narrowly missed their target, but the net is closing in fast. By the spring of 2006, the hunt for Abu Musab al Zarqawi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, has reached a turning point. An elite assault team from the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, has secured a major breakthrough following a daring raid on a terrorist safe house.
The momentum had shifted. The raids of his network were getting faster and closer to him, and so you had the sense, we're going to get there.
As well as capturing several senior members of al-Qaeda in the raid, JSOC soldiers discover a video of enemy number one, al Zarqawi. Hoping to tarnish his fearsome reputation, the coalition releases the full, unedited video to the media. It contains the familiar footage of the terrorist leader parading through the desert, confidently firing a machine gun. But it also shows another side to al Zarqawi, a slightly overweight, unimpressive figure of a man.
Here's Zarqawi, the ultimate warrior, trying to shoot his machine gun. It's supposed to be automatic fire. He's shooting single shots.
No sooner does he figure out how to switch his weapon to fully automatic when it jams, and the self-styled holy warrior can't get it going again.
He looks down, can't figure it out, calls his friend to unblock the stoppage and get the weapon firing again.
He also appears to be going into battle wearing a nice pair of white trainers, hardly the image of a man threatening the might of America.
It makes you wonder.
Meanwhile, deep inside JSOC's secret detention center, the task force's interrogators get to work on their captives.
The men that we brought in, we called the Group of Five, and we knew that there were 5 important members of al-Qaeda, but we didn't know what their roles were. And they had this very unbelievable story that they were there to attend a wedding, even though there was no bride or groom, and there were suicide bombers in the house. And little by little, we would get information from one of them, and then we would take that and turn around and use it against the other 4.
One member of the group, the senior AQI operative known as Abu Haida, refuses to say anything.
He was interrogated for about 20 days. And during that time, he just maintained this story that he was just there to videotape a wedding, even though it was completely unbelievable.
For weeks, rotating teams of interrogators try psychological pressure, pleas for cooperation, subtle threats, and subtle promises. Eventually, they decide he will not talk and arrange to have him sent to Iraq's main detention facility, Abu Ghraib prison.
I decided that I would go and interrogate him one last time before he left. And I didn't really have permission to do that, but I felt that he could provide very important information towards finding Zarqawi. And that conversation started with nothing about al-Qaeda, nothing about terrorism. It just started with a friendly conversation about who he was, what was his life story, how did he come to be sitting in a chair opposite me, and getting to know each other.
Over the course of 5.5 hours, Matthew Alexander discovers Abu Haida has a fatal weakness: his arrogance. He believes he has beaten the mighty American machine and should be recognized for it. Alexander obliges him.
I would constantly stroke his ego, constantly make him believe in this fallacy that in his head, that he was a very important man, that he could affect the future of Iraq. And then in the last 15 minutes, what I did was essentially offer him a deal. I offered him the chance to work with us instead of al-Qaeda in a secret program that didn't exist. in which he could be a person who could influence the future of Iraq. And he decided to work with me.
Over the next few weeks, Alexander visits Abu Haider in his cell at night and coaxes more and more information out of him about al-Zarqawi's whereabouts. All on the pretext of proving his worth for the non-existent secret program.
I said, "You're so close to getting this program. All we need is that one last piece of information that'll convince my bosses." And he said every month Zarqawi would meet with his spiritual advisor, who was our detainee's best friend.
It's the piece of intelligence that everyone has been waiting for. For years, al-Zarqawi has been a ghost, striking with impunity. Now, at last, JSOC has what it needs to find him and take him out.
The intelligence and military effort that had been put together was beginning to close the noose around his neck. We knew that Zarqawi had a spiritual advisor. We knew that he was going to visit him. It was just a matter of being patient.
Using this information, JSOC quickly traces the spiritual advisor and begins following him day and night. Using high-tech systems like Predator drones, as well as old-fashioned undercover operatives, they create what McChrystal calls the unblinking eye. Their target is never out of sight. Abu Haider tells Alexander that if they want to find al-Zarqawi, they need to look for one particular sign.
We would know when he was going to meet with Zarqawi because he would change cars from a white car to a blue car. And whenever he got in this blue car, that meant he was going to meet Zarqawi.
Once again, it was a joint US-UK surveillance on a building in Baghdad. Lo and behold, they realized by following his movements that every few days this man got into his car. They used Predator and other methods to follow his car as it went up the road to this place in the palm groves near Tikrit, where indeed Abu Musab al Zarqawi himself was hiding.
By now, pictures from the drone are being fed live to JSOC's command center. Everyone, including General McChrystal himself, is watching in silence as al-Zarqawi's spiritual advisor gets out of the car. Then, Abu Musab al Zarqawi himself appears.
Once the blue car arrived at the house, helicopters took off immediately to go to that house and capture Zarqawi. And it was about 20 minutes away.
A discussion is held in the command center. Is it worth trying to capture al-Zarqawi alive in broad daylight? Is it better to wait until nightfall and take him when he's asleep? If they strike now, they risk a heavy firefight and numerous casualties. Worse, al-Zarqawi is a master of the last-minute escape. If they wait, he could easily slip through the net again. This could be their one and only chance to finish the job.
And there was a period of time in which we were just waiting. I was watching it live on a video, and we were just waiting.
McChrystal believes there is no time to lose. He can't even wait 20 minutes for the assault force to arrive by helicopter. He opts for another plan, designed to take al-Zarqawi completely by surprise. He calls up 2 F-16 fighters patrolling nearby.
We were expecting to watch the helicopters land in the raid, which we typically would watch. And instead, after about maybe a 5-minute wait, the house just exploded.
They knew he was in the building, and they made the decision without losing any time to prosecute the target. So they didn't even feel there was time to get one of their special ops task forces in the air to go and raid the building. They simply decided to hit it with bombs from an F-16, which is what they did.
Just minutes after the bombing, special forces arrive at the house. Incredibly, they find al Zarqawi still alive in the wreckage.
A soldier grabbed him, and then Zarqawi died. And it was sort of a sweet justice, if you will, that Zarqawi's last image was a U.S. soldier grabbing him.
The day following the raid, the U.S. announces to the world that they have their man at last.
Good morning. Now Zarqawi has met his end, and this violent man will never murder again.
Pictures are released of his dead body as grim confirmation.
Zarqawi could be responsible for upwards of almost 100,000 deaths by starting the civil war in Iraq. And so I don't think the world's going to miss him.
It's a devastating blow to al-Qaeda in Iraq. The man who was thought to be invincible is dead. But the work is not over. With the intelligence that was collected from the smoldering remains of al-Zarqawi's compound, another series of raids is launched. And AQI starts to fall like a stack of dominoes.
There was, a good deal of chaos inside the organization. And what you do is, when you're targeting Zarqawi, you're also collecting intelligence on the network. And so what that allows you to do is the minute he's dead, they're far more vulnerable, the people around him, than they realize.
Killing him undoubtedly had an impact. There was a lot of exploitation from the raid. A lot of material was recovered. And we can see that little by little, through 2006, through to the early part of 2007, they did successfully take them down. So Zarqawi, if you like, was evidence of a bigger strategy that was really getting seriously effective by that point. And certainly by the summer of 2007, al-Qaeda in Iraq had largely been smashed.
And so you do a series of raids that is devastating, and they never really came back from his death.
Today, the Joint Special Operations Command is the group of special forces operators that is tasked with planning and executing dangerous and secretive missions for the United States. The black ops it conducts have continued to strike at the heart of al-Qaeda and other terror groups around the world. In 2011, it was JSOC that planned and executed the mission to take down the world's most wanted man, Osama bin Laden.
You have to win. And at the end of the day, when the heat is on, you're going to do whatever it takes to win.